Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Cornerstone Community Center here in Hartford, Vermont. And I am pleased to present this financial forum with the State Treasurer, Mike Pieciak, and Esme Cole, our state representative, and myself, Joe Major, the town of Hartford Treasurer, are so excited to have Mr. Pieciak here to give some insight into financial matters that concern the state of Vermont. And in particular, money that's available both for businesses as well as for individuals. So, Treasurer Pieciak, I am excited to have you here, and if you can come up and give a few words, and both State Representative Cole and myself will ask you a few questions, as well as the audience as well. So you can clap for him as well.
Well, thank you very much, Joe. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you very much, Esme, for having put the forum on. It's a pleasure to be here in your home community. Pleasure to be talking about some of the things going on in the state of Vermont and some of the opportunities that we see that are available, as Joe mentioned, for businesses and individuals on the horizon. I think the Office of the Treasurer, just to sort of bring it back to what we've been focused on, broadly we've been really focused on financial equity across the board. So financial equity for me means, I think that's deeply rooted in social justice. How do we undo the harms and the systemic harms that have been occurring in our economy for generations? How do we build in more equity? How do we build in more opportunity? How do we expand the economy so that it works for everybody? And with that sort of mindset, we've gone out and tried to focus on policies that achieve those objectives. I think the three that I'll talk about today: affordable housing, retirement security, and then trying to attack, I would call it attack because it's sort of a more aggressive way of saying challenging generational poverty, which is a real issue. And it's an issue that's holding back families and communities and individuals. But to start with the first one, affordable housing, that I think is our biggest issue that's facing the state of Vermont. I know when I went around and visited with communities throughout the state, we visited all 252 communities in Vermont when we ran for treasurer 2 years ago. So that was quite the endeavor. And every town you went to, you asked them, how are things going, to the town clerk? And they say, well, it's really busy, it's really busy. And you say, why is it so busy? And they say, well, there's been a lot of people that moved into town. They are buying homes, and, there are a lot of real estate transactions. And I say, wow, can you tell us more about that? And they say, well, usually they've come from out of state. They've paid with their home in cash. They've paid above the asking price. They've waived all the contingencies. And it's like, well, that's really interesting. And that same story was told time and time and time again in every community that we visited with in Vermont, whether it was down here in the Upper Valley or up near Chittenden County in southern Vermont. It was the same story. So we got in office about a year ago. We said, let's see if we can put some more hard data to this. Like, is this just anecdotal, or is there some sort of hard data that we can measure whether people have moved to Vermont and to what degree have they moved into Vermont over the last few years? And there's two really good sources of data. There's the IRS and there's the Census Bureau. IRS is tracking tax returns, so it's sort of hard data. They're looking at how many people file a tax return in Vermont, how many people have moved out of Vermont in a particular year, where did they move to, where did they move from. Census data does the same thing. It's a little bit more of an estimate, but they're both sort of good sources of information. So we looked at the IRS data, and lo and behold, for the 8 years building up to the pandemic, Vermont had been losing taxpayers. Less, 500 fewer taxpayers, 1,000 fewer taxpayers, whatever it might be. But every year for 8 years, we were losing taxpayers, and we were losing tax base as well. Once the pandemic hit, and you looked at the data from 2020 and 2021, you saw a clear reversal in that trend. We had about 6,000 new individuals move into Vermont for those 2 years, so that was about 3,000 more tax filers generally moving into Vermont. So it might not sound like a lot, but when you think of the context of that trend, that we've been seeing people leaving for 8 years, and now all of a sudden we have a reversal and people are moving here. And when you dig in on the IRS data, it's not just that folks are moving here, but they were the kind of demographic that we've really been trying to encourage in Vermont. 84% of them were between the ages of 26 and 44. So young people moving back to Vermont with presumably young families and long careers ahead of them, building their future here in Vermont. Also, from a financial standpoint, I think it's 77% were making over $100,000 adjusted gross income, over 50% making over $200,000 adjusted gross income. So generally, there were people moving to Vermont. They were younger. They were generally wealthier. And what that said to me was they're probably bringing their job with them. I don't know about you, but it's not too many $200,000 jobs here in Vermont, I think, for most folks. So that has a good element to it, and it has a challenge to it. The good element is when you look at our tax revenue, that has consistently marched up in the personal income tax. We haven't raised taxes, but our tax collection went from 800 million to 1.2 billion, so $400 million increase over the last 5 or 6 fiscal years. Some of that's inflation, some of that's other factors, but a lot of it I would tie back to that population change we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years. So that's the good news. But the bad news is that when people have moved to Vermont, when we already had a housing shortage, it means that they're taking a home off of the market. And when they're bringing their job with them, it means that they're taking a home off of the market without adding a job to the local workforce. So it's putting even more pressure on those that earn a living in Vermont to find affordable housing. It just is reducing the supply even more for the demand that exists. Yes?
Of the data you looked at from the IRS and the census, how much of that accounted for people who live out of state that are just buying like second vacation homes or whatnot?
Yeah. So if you're in both of the measurements, it would be looking at residents that moved here. So on top of the residents that moved here, you could also have people buying second homes. That would put even more pressure on the housing market. And the other thing putting pressure too is short-term rentals, right? I mean, that can be something that in Stowe or Woodstock or there's a lot of communities where a lot of those short-term rentals have put pressure on the housing stock. So I think at the end of the day, what is the answer to that? It's really to build more housing to meet the demand. It's to build more housing in places that make sense for there to be more housing, places that have infrastructure built in already, places that are dense and downtown so people don't have to drive their cars as much, places that are safe from future climate catastrophe as much as we can as well, and building places in a resilient way. So I know the legislature is working on bills that would support that financially, but also support that from a sort of policy standpoint, from a land use policy standpoint. I think that's going to be critical for us going forward. But the issue is not just here and now. I mean, that pressure is here and now for all of us. But I guess my point on housing is it's not going to get better anytime soon. I mean, I think we have to, prepare ourselves for not sort of a short-term engagement on this issue. We have to be focused on it for quite some time. I would suggest for a decade or more. It takes a while to build. We were underbuilding new housing for quite some time in Vermont. We're starting to see an upswing of more units being built per year than we have earlier in the decade. But there's more work that needs to be done. But the other point, the reason I say it's going to continue to be an issue for us is, there are estimates that 88,000 people in our workforce in Vermont, which our workforce is 325,000. But 88,000 people are going to be retiring by the year 2030. So by the year 2030, Department of Labor estimates 88,000 people will be retiring out of our workforce. So what does that mean? In the same way that people are moving to Vermont with a remote job and taking a house out of the market without adding a job to the local workforce, we're potentially going to have a lot of Vermonters retiring, not going to necessarily leave Vermont. They might move part-time, but they might keep their house. They might just stay here permanently, but they'll no longer be working in the workforce. So to replace them in the workforce will require an additional unit of housing to be built to be able to accomplish that. So that pressure is going to be on us for the next 5, 10, 15 years and beyond. I think the other thing that's going to be a pressure point is continued desire to live in a place like Vermont. a relatively resilient state from climate change and the worst impacts of climate change. A state that I think has great community. That was on display during the COVID-19 pandemic, certainly. And I think people have a new desire for that, a new craving for that. At least certain people, want to have that in a place where they live. They want to know who their neighbors are. They want to feel safe and secure because they know their neighbors are there to help them and support them. So I think Vermont will continue to be an attractive place for people to move to over the next few decades. So for all of those reasons, really critical that we focus on housing. And just to be even more specific, I think senior housing is a critical piece of our housing portfolio that we have to focus on. I say that because we're an older state and we have a lot of people that own their homes that are in that aging demographic, and largely their homes are sort of overbuilt for them, right? Like it served a great purpose when they had a young family with 3 or 4 kids, but now there might be a couple, or might just be one person living in a house with multiple bedrooms. There was a study done by MIT that looked at how many beds across America, how many bedrooms across America go unoccupied on a given night, and they estimated 54 million bedrooms go unoccupied on a given night. So if you did that proportion for Vermont, it's about 100,000 bedrooms in Vermont that would go unoccupied in a given night. It could be second homeowners, could be short-term rentals. Like my parents, they have a 4-bedroom home, and now they live on the first floor, so all 4 bedrooms are unused every single night. So there is a lot of bedrooms in Vermont, but we don't necessarily have the right alignment of who needs to have the 4-bedroom or 3-bedroom home. So again, focusing on senior housing, I think will allow us to build homes and build units for those that are older Vermonters that are looking to downsize or looking for a safer place to live, have a place to go, so that can free up a home in the market for a younger family. So I think all housing is really important for us to focus on. I think senior housing is going to be really critical for us to focus on going forward. And it's one of the reasons we created, or expanded, I should say, this 10% in Vermont program. And what our focus was to focus it on housing. So this was a program that would support economic development and job creation out of our office. We have a lot more revenues in the state. I mentioned how our tax revenue has gone up. We have a lot more money in our state bank account, if you will. It allowed us to expand this program by $85 million. And then we focused on affordable housing as one of our main investments. And we've made $55.5 million of low interest loans so far across Vermont in housing. And our expectation is that 55.5 million will leverage another 340 million to support 1,100 units across the state. So it's one way of trying to tackle the problem by cutting through this high interest rate environment with low interest loans, so that projects can continue to go forward until interest rates return to a more normal level. But that financing side, that payment side, is just a piece of it. We also have to make it more affordable, less expensive to build homes in Vermont, which ties back to our land use policies and work that the legislators that are here, are working on and engaged on. So both of those things, I think, are critical for us. If we're not going to solve it overnight. We're going to have to focus on it for year after year for quite some time. So I think we just need to prepare ourselves for that. But there's a lot of optimism around that. Before the pandemic, I don't know how you all felt here in the Upper Valley, but it didn't seem like people wanted to live in Vermont or move to Vermont. Like there was a lot of opportunity elsewhere, financial opportunity elsewhere, business opportunity, professional opportunity, personal opportunity elsewhere. And since the pandemic, that has really seemed to change and flip it on its head 180. And now there is a real strong desire to live in Vermont. Even young people that grew up here, who normally you would think would go away and seek opportunity in New York or out west, now they want to spend their time, in Vermont, and their careers in Vermont, because there are a lot more professional opportunity for them here. Not just because they can work remotely, which certainly they can, but there's also been a resurgence of economic activity, I would say, across the board in Vermont. Maybe felt more here in the Upper Valley and Chittenden County than some of the other parts of our state. But one of the other things that's happened since the pandemic is a significant increase in private capital investment in Vermont. Last year, the amount of venture capital money invested in our state was $550 million, $550 million in Vermont venture capital. The year before that was about the same. So Over those 2 years combined, we've had over $1 billion of venture capital money invested into Vermont businesses. That makes Vermont the #1 state in the country in terms of the percent increase pre-pandemic and post-pandemic for that kind of investment in businesses throughout Vermont. So those businesses are doing really interesting things. They're expanding, they're adding employees. You talk to them and say, why are you in Vermont? And they'll mention the community here in Vermont. They'll mention the outdoor recreational opportunities that they as business owners want to have, but also their employees want to have as well. And that's just that last point I want to make on housing, because it's important that we build more housing, but it's also important that we build it in the right places, because our outdoor recreational opportunities are really what make us special. Our beautiful outdoor areas, our scenic valleys and mountains. But we also have to have housing for people to be able to live here and afford to be able to do it in an economic way. So that balance is going to be really important for us going forward. So that program, Vermont Saves, that program, the 10% in Vermont, is something that we're continuing to find projects and continuing to make investment, and we hope to have another round of investment sometime in 2024. Another program that we launched last year, and I want to thank the legislators, Senator White and Esme, for supporting Vermont Saves. Thank you very much. It was, I know they supported it because we passed it unanimously through the legislature. So, but Vermont Saves, and Kim Souza's here too, because she's now on our advisory board for Vermont Saves, and I appreciate that as representing business owners that I hope will be able to benefit from this program. But another piece of financial equity is thinking about retirement. How are we going to make a more secure retirement for people in Vermont? And oftentimes you think of retirement as like a multiple stool sort of problem. You have Social Security, you have your own savings, and then maybe you have whatever your workplace retirement was, right? Your 401k or your pension. But over time, so many Americans are losing what was assurance of a secure retirement through their pension, whether public or private. It's switched much more to a 401k system, where you are ultimately responsible for making sure you have saved enough money, you have invested it in a right way, that it will grow to a point where you can have a secure retirement and you won't outlive your retirement, right? That's a concern, I think, for most Americans, not having enough money in retirement. But the problem's even greater for people that don't have access to retirement through their workplace. So we estimate there are anywhere between 85,000 to 100,000 Vermonters in Vermont that work for employers that don't offer a retirement savings program. They don't offer a pension. They don't offer a 401k. And what does that mean? It sounds like maybe it's a small thing, but the data will show that like 95% of people, basically everybody that does not get offered a workplace retirement program, is not saving for their retirement. People don't go out and set up generally their own Roth IRAs, their own IRA. They wait for their employer to provide them a retirement benefit, and then they do an automatic payroll deduction, and then they start saving for retirement, and it's really simple for them. So for those employers that are too small to offer a 401k, they're too small to be able to afford that, we thought this Vermont Saves program, which has been employed in a handful of other states, was really a good solution for that. The Treasurer's Office manages the program. We select a vendor. We provide the framework and the apparatus. We require businesses that don't offer a retirement program to sign up for Vermont Saves if you have 5 or more employees. If you have under that number of employees, you can voluntarily participate, but at least at the beginning, you're not required to. There's no cost to the business. That was really important for us. And there's no ongoing cost to Vermont taxpayers either. The program is funded by charging a % fee on the monies that are going to be put in these accounts once they start getting funded by employees. So the program, the employer signs up. Automatically, a Roth IRA will be established for their employees unless the employee opts out of the system. That's another important part of it, is it's an opt-out system. So you have to affirmatively take action to not be part of it. If you don't opt out, then you will start having a payroll deduction. Originally, it will be 5%, and then it will go up to 8% over time. That money will go into the Roth IRA. It'll be invested in a way that's consistent with your likely retirement goals based on your age. You can adjust that. You can be as active in the system as you want to be. But basically, if you haven't taken any action toward it, these sort of decisions will be made for you, which will likely be, for most people, the right financial decision for them, saving for retirement, putting it in a long-term investment account. And then because it's a Roth IRA, the other great thing about it is if at some point your car breaks down, you need a few $1,000s. We don't obviously want people to do this. We want them to save for their retirement and have it compound over time. But it's always your money. The principal that you put into the Roth IRA can be taken without penalty or tax. So it serves as a emergency savings account as well. Again, you want folks to continue to stay invested, but it does have that emergency savings account aspect as well. So in other states, they've seen like 70% or more of employees that are eligible for this program stay in the program. They're starting to see on average like $2,000 a year be saved by this population, which is really great. I mean, this group of people, this 88,000 or so people in Vermont, overrepresented by young people, overrepresented by lower income individuals, overrepresented by BIPOC members, overrepresented female more than male. It's the exact population that we want to make sure we're providing resources to so that they can help themselves have a strong financial foundation as they go into their careers. So we're really excited about that. We hope for it to be up and running within the next year or so. It's actually ahead of schedule, so knock on wood, that will stay that way. But we think it'll have a big impact for those individuals as they look for retirement and to retire with dignity. We think it'll have a big impact on the economy as people have a more independent retirement. They have more resources in retirement to spend. And then we think it's a big impact on the budget long term as people are less dependent on state services and state resources, that we can free some of those up to focus on some of our other needs. And then the last program I wanted to mention, which is a proposal that we put out this year, something called Baby Bonds. And it's something that we're very excited about. So Baby Bonds is trying to tackle this issue of generational poverty, like I mentioned. So generational poverty, it's also trying to focus on rural economic development, and it's also focusing on retaining young people in Vermont. So the generational poverty piece, there's so many individuals, I think, in our economy across Vermont, across the country, who just don't have the opportunity to buy a home, because the difference between renting and buying a home is that down payment that they can't save up for. Or somebody that has a great idea, but they can't quite start a business because they don't have their own resources, nor do they come from a place of privilege where their family is able to provide them resources to start a business. Same potentially with education as well. I know, even thinking about myself, like growing up, I grew up in Brattleboro, and my parents, or my grandparents on my dad's side, they, by no means came from any, means, but they would set aside a treasury bond, or a bond of $100 when it was my birthday, or something happened in their lives and they won the lottery, and they're not the big lottery but the small lottery, and put aside $500, or and all that money, all those savings bonds added up, and by the time I was looking to buy my first home, it was like $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, and it ended up being a significant portion of a down payment. And not a lot of people have that opportunity, to have family members contribute in that way and have those resources. So Baby Bonds would put aside $3,200 for every child in Vermont born on Dr. Dinosaur, born on Medicaid. So basically, out of all the children born in Vermont, these are the 37% or so that are the most impoverished, coming from the most impoverished families across our state. That $3,200 would be invested by our office. It would grow over time to about $12,000 at the age of 18, to about $24,000 at the age of 30. And then the baby bond could be claimed by those individuals between those years, 18 and 30, for the specific purposes of, one, buying a home in Vermont, two, starting a business or investing in a business in Vermont, going for higher education or job training, or rolling it over into their retirement. So those four things were really intentionally picked by the person that came up with this concept, because they're all wealth generating activities. They're all things that passively grow your equity in your home, the value in your home, the equity in your business, the investing in yourself through higher education, your retirement, and investing for the long term. And it also supports rural economic development, because most of the children born on Medicaid are actually born in the more rural parts of Vermont, like the Northeast Kingdom and many parts of southern Vermont and many parts of Windsor and Orange County as well. And then that retention of young people, you have to be born in Vermont to be eligible for the baby bond. But then you also have to be a Vermont resident when you claim the bond. And then many of those activities occur in Vermont, like buying a home and starting a business here in Vermont. So just like Vermont says, we think it can have a long-term, significant beneficial impact for those individuals that get a baby bond, for the communities that they live in, and then also for our state budget, as people are less dependent on state resources and state benefits as they go through their professional careers. So we also have a proposal to fund it without any additional revenue that's required from the state, from a program that's in our office called Unclaimed Property. There's excess money in unclaimed property every year that goes to the general fund. And the way that it goes to the general fund now, it's usually unbudgeted, so it ends up being sort of one-time expenses in the future. So we're suggesting putting those one-time expenses instead for this dedicated purpose. And it would cover the cost of the program, which would be about $6 million a year. So that one we're really excited about. Thank, I believe both the representative and senator are co-sponsors on that baby bonds proposal, so I appreciate that. Both begin with P.
That's a compliment. So just to be clear, and I am a co-sponsor of the bill, so it may be better for me not to admit this question. And I shouldn't admit this either, but I was born in New Hampshire.
Yes.
At Dartmouth College, to the chagrin, exactly, Dartmouth Hitchcock, to the chagrin of my family. A Vermonter who is born in New Hampshire would also be eligible for this program.
Yeah, exactly right. So Medicaid, Dr. Dinosaur is the key eligibility. And oftentimes, Vermont does a lot of good things, a lot of things well. And I think this medical care for people that are pregnant is one of them. I mean, when we looked at the data, 5,000, 5,500 births a year, 2,100, 2,200, 21 to 2,200 maybe on Medicaid. And then there were only about 10 a year that were uninsured. So really, broad coverage. And it's not just that it covers the birth, but usually Dr. Dinosaur is certainly eligible for the whole pregnancy. And usually people are signing up, for the significant portion of that pregnancy. So it doesn't matter if you're on a trip overseas and all of a sudden you have your child, or you're traveling to see family, or you go to Dartmouth Hitchcock. It's the Dr. Dinosaur, which is the eligibility. And that obviously has a residential requirement for the parent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So there's the buying a home has to be in Vermont, opening a business has to be in Vermont, but if you're going to college or putting it towards your retirement fund,
Yes.
there's no Vermont link connection with that.
So on the retirement, so some question is like, how are you going to,
Could I just have you repeat the question?
oh yeah, of course.
Members are mic.
Yeah, for sure. The question was, what is the Vermont connection to higher ed or to retirement? That there's a Vermont connection to buying a home in Vermont and starting a business in Vermont. And one of the broader questions that folks have is sort of like, how are you going to ensure that the money's going to those purposes, those four purposes? And, we and the other state that's passed this proposal, Connecticut, have been thinking about that for the past year. And I think our thought is when you're buying a home, it would go right to the escrow agent as the down payment. If you're starting a business, or if you're investing in a business, it would go right to that business you're investing in, with the investment contract being the sort of the receipt there. Potentially, if you're starting a business, you would have a pre-approved list of expenses or something, you could handle that. But then when it comes to retirement, one of the things I'm thinking of at least is, we're investing that money for you. There's no reason to claim it until you're 30 years old, because you're not going to need it for a lot longer down the road. And then hopefully at the age of 30, somebody's more settled in Vermont. They're not going to just get the money and then cash it out. And, but I think you could also say that that they have to have the retirement with a Vermont financial institution, at least initially, so that there is some connection. And then for the higher ed piece, we've been going back and forth on that, because you could easily say it has to be at a Vermont higher education institution, but we've been thinking about scenarios where, what if somebody gets a better, financial aid deal in another state? Or what if they want to go to an all-women's school and we don't have one in Vermont, or historically black college and we don't have one in Vermont? Or what if it's just a different program that is important to them? So we did not include it with a Vermont connection, and there's been some discussion about that in the legislature, and you know, it's not a hill that we want to, die on in terms of the overall program, but that's at least how we initially proposed it. Yeah.
Concerning housing?
Yeah.
Going back to that, an impediment of building housing has been Act 250.
Yes.
Do you see any reforms for that? There are always unintended consequences to something that, and actually was a good thing, but
Yeah.
now.
Well, it's that balance, right? I mean, because Act 250 preserved, it's thought of as or it was an environmental, conservation, environmental protection, all of those things. And it's Vermont's natural beauty and environment that make us so special. So it's like done a really great job at preserving that. But the other thing that's sort of happening now, to your point, when it's limiting density and it's limiting the ability to build at greater heights or greater unit sizes, it's putting pressure on our suburban and rural areas because it's pushing out sprawl and pushing out development. And I think that's the opposite of what we want. We want it to sort of cluster around village centers and town centers. So the legislature, I don't know if the senator and representative were part of a tripartisan bill, but there was a tripartisan bill that was announced with the governor to bring some modernization to Act 250 to make sure that there are still the preservation aspects throughout much of Vermont, but that it's easier to build in our communities that have things like water and sewer, that have population density, that have that infrastructure to be able to support more housing and increase population growth. So that will be a big piece of legislation, and I think that'll be one of the big items on the legislature's agenda this year. Yes?
What are the prospects for a more graduated income tax in Vermont, starting with a guaranteed basic income and not vilifying the top 1%, focusing only on them, but a steeper tax curve?
So the question was, I forgot to repeat the earlier question, but the question was, what about a more graduated income threshold in Vermont? What are the prospects for it? So there is a proposal in the legislature that would increase the rates for some of the higher end income earners in Vermont, and I don't know the prospects of that bill. I think they might not be great, but you might all have a better sense of that than I do. But I know going into the session, at least some of the prognosticators that were willing to talk about it were saying, they're not sure it's going to go through the session. But to your point about, go ahead, Esme.
I can speak
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
some of the ideas just
Yeah,
a
yeah.
little bit too. So, and I know I'm not on the mic.
Yeah, come on up.
I can talk. So that is a very good question. Vermont ranks pretty well when it comes to being progressive in terms of the way we tax things, but it's turning out that the reason we're ranking so high as a progressive state in the way we tax is because we do a better job at protecting the lowest income bracket of Vermonters with things such as the childhood tax credit and
The homestead tax.
yep, homestead tax and why am I forgetting? But anyway, but what we don't do as great a job at is taxing the highest bracket as compared to some other states, better than some, but worse than some. So there are two proposals in the House Ways and Means Committee. One proposal is to have a 3% surcharge on income tax or income earners of over 500,000, which is, we'll see how many tax earners we have for people who fall into that income bracket for a salary. And the second proposal is to do a better job taxing unrealized means. So assets that if you have, I believe it's over $100 million in unrealized gains, they're trying to work out mechanisms to do a better job at taxing those. And that second proposal would actually bring in a huge piece of revenue. So that could level the playing field and bring us into a more progressive and, like you said, the slope that we want to see in the perfect world of taxation. but that's what I know so far. And Public Assets Institute is an interesting group that has done a lot of research on both of these two proposals. And they've had a decent presence in the State House so far this session. So I would keep an eye on the House Ways and Means Committee because I do think that will come up in discussion this session. And I'm also happy to keep in touch with you about what I learn from those discussions.
Any motion on a guaranteed basic income at the other end of the spectrum?
Mike, do you have any?
Yeah, I just, Esme, there's not a proposal as far as I know in the legislature right now. Oh, there is? Oh, go ahead.
I introduced.
Oh, nice. I'll say one thing about the concept, though. I mean, the concept of baby bonds sort of comes out of, it's sort of a cousin, I think, of guaranteed or universal income. Yeah. But one thing I'll just mention is during this process of doing due diligence on baby bonds, we went to Spectrum Youth Services.
Yeah, that's it, yeah.
And Spectrum Youth Services has this direct cash payment program where I think they're starting out with like maybe a dozen or 18 students, and they're giving them $1,800 a month for like 18 months or something.
Nailing it, yeah.
And but to hear the story from an individual that was willing to share it, and the individual had been in foster care, and she said like she never was able to have security for 1 second of her life. Like her life was always so uncertain because of her financial situation, and that this $1,800 a month is the first time that she has felt any security in her life, and it was quite powerful and moving to hear that. So it's an interesting concept that I think Senator White will love to talk more about.
Oh, wow. He's so good at that. Okay. Yeah. So I introduced a bill to that effect, which would give foster youth. It was kind of like a little trying to sliver it in there. Like, hey, look, if it supports foster youth who are getting out of the system, maybe we should value other people. And, it's a slow roll. But essentially, the bill did what Spectrum ultimately ended up doing in Burlington, where they give that cash payment in addition to other services, support for housing, other beneficiary programs. So it's not taking away, like you're not just giving folks cash and then taking away the benefits. It's an additional, which is what some other places have done instead, which is not, in my opinion, universal basic income. So that bill was meant to create a pilot program that for every youth leaving foster care in Vermont when they turned 18, they got a cash payment for a pilot for 3 years. So we're still exploring that. Representative Wood, who chairs Human Services in the House, was really interested in the bill, and Representative Dan Noyes introduced it on the House side as a sister bill. So there's a lot of potentially positive things that we could see out of that. There may even be a way that we can draw down some federal money, but that's, I think, what will make or break if we move forward with the bill. But I think you'll see a UBI bill, a true, like, actual UBI bill versus that kind of sliver attempt, if not next session, the session after.
Is there a price tag for the pilot program?
Oh, yeah. It was, we were looking at, like, I want to say like $750,000 for the first year. But that was like a small chunk of people. It's actually a very small number of children who leave the foster care system who would have qualified. It was surprising. But JFO did a fiscal note.
Nice.
So, yeah.
Joint Fiscal Office.
Yes, JFO stands for Joint Fiscal Office, which is the organization that gives us all of our numbers as a state. And both the administration and the legislature and everyone else uses them to get their numbers. So we're all in agreement when they put those numbers out.
Yeah, nice.
Which is not every state.
That's true. Any other questions for? Oh yeah. Well.
I raised my hand. All right. Well, so my name's Jesse. I happen to chair the Energy Commission.
Oh, nice.
Hartford was the first to have an Energy Commission.
Really? Nice.
So, I'm not sure if we were the first to have a climate action plan, but we may have been. Right next to me is town staff in charge of this.
Nice.
So there are a lot of things going for Hartford. We know we have
TIF district dedicated to maintaining and growing our public infrastructure. We have a dense downtown block, right, with landowners, town staff, infrastructure including wastewater and drinking water. So we see that White River Junction has the opportunity to really host a lot of this affordable housing or housing that is affordable growth in our downtown area. Now, here I am, you're wondering why the chair of the Energy Commission wants to talk about housing. But where I'm coming at it is, you take a step back and you look at climate change, you look at affordability of renewable energy systems. Most of our concern comes down to winter heating. And so something that we've been proactively thinking about is how, when all these housing developments are gonna come in, do we make it cost effective and clean? Not that we don't wanna take away from the affordability, we wanna see how they merge. And so I'm curious if, I know there's legislation out there for thermal energy networks, and our state went off internationally just to examine what Denmark is doing. But from a climate infrastructure coupled with social impact, affordable housing perspective, I think there are many people at Hartford who would appreciate learning a little bit more about how the state could step in and enable some of that thinking.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, Jesse, generally, because, like, to your point, that's a really important energy use, right? It's like winter heating. In Vermont, we have the oldest, it's not oldest by average, I guess, but it's the most homes built before 1929 or something. So we have one of the oldest housing stocks in the country. So when you think about that combination, it's really a challenge. And then all of the energy improvements in new builds often are the first things to go when there's rising costs and rising interest rates and et cetera, So it's a real challenge right now to balance that affordability of building new housing with that long-term benefit of getting those energy savings, both financial savings and also climate savings as well. We did an analysis on the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has a lot of funds available to it for climate action. The legislature asked us to take a look. And we did just file that report, and we did have a recommendation to establish a credit facility, kind of similar to the one I mentioned for housing, but it would be dedicated for, what we would call climate finance. So it would be weatherization, electrification, it would be green energy production, and it would be resiliency. And it would be 2.5% of the state's deposits. It would be tens of millions of dollars, for that purpose. And we'd look to work with entities like the Vermont Economic Development Authority or others to be able to put this financing into place. It would just be a piece of what's needed. But I think, again, just in the same way that the housing component met the moment because inflation was so high, interest rates were so high, hopefully this can make some favorable progress as well. Yeah.
Quick response is, so in the downtown area,
Yeah.
a lot of the landowners and town staff, we view this as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get it right.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that Cli-Fi opportunity can be available later this year or early next, I know the clock's ticking on a lot of this infrastructure. That would be great to collaborate with you on.
Yeah,
what
great.
we can really do here.
Yeah, wonderful. And I think you also, some of the other things that I think, are going for the community, right? You have the train goes right into town. You have the interstate, both 89 and 91. So I think, oftentimes geography is destiny, and you happen to be located in a place that I think is going to benefit in the future from that kind of infrastructure. Yeah, Esme.
I can also share an update with an exciting piece of climate news relating to a bill, which is H809. So it's a bill that will be taken up in judiciary, and this bill would establish a climate superfund. So it is kind of groundbreaking, but there is similar legislation happening in New York as well, which gives us a little bit more oomph in our go-ahead, because we're not alone in the process. But basically, we would charge a fine on the 5 largest oil companies that we can attribute to polluting Vermont specifically. And so we're going back, I think, to data from 1990 or so, I think, to track and do an analysis of the repercussions and costs, the real costs on Vermonters because of climate change as a result, and directly from these 5 largest polluters. And this, if it were to be successful, this fund would be managed by the Treasurer's Office. So really interesting concept, and it's actually getting a lot of headway. We had over 100 co-sponsors on the bill, which is a pretty huge deal, and from both parties as well, I believe. So yeah, I don't know, Mike, if you have anything you'd want to add about that.
Well, I think just, to your point, like, I think it's called colloquially, make big oil pay.
Yeah.
And I think the idea is, fossil fuel companies, both through their, knowledge and maybe sometimes their indirect knowledge, contributed to a changing climate that's now having financial repercussions for individuals and communities and states, that if they were the cause of it, then they should be responsible for helping clean it up. So I think at the highest level, it makes a lot of sense, and I think that's why it resonated probably with so many legislators. Our office would be tasked with trying to analyze, how much damage can you actually tie back to changing climate, which would require, an estimate of, what our climate would be like without all the CO2 from fossil fuel industry in the atmosphere, and then how much more supercharged are weather events as a result of it, and then trying to make a calculation there about what the damages are to communities. So I think it's something that we've done actually to some degree. When I was the insurance commissioner here in Vermont, we looked at the impact of climate change on the insurance industry, and we got claims for the last 10 years, and we looked at meteorological data for those 10 years, and then we projected it forward, and we said, how has the changing climate impacted insurance claims? And it did turn out that things like, not snow, which is often what you think about, a snowstorm causing a car accident or snow on a roof causing it to cave in, those weren't the things that were driving claims. More and more, it was hail events and wind events were driving claims in Vermont, both in terms of the total frequency and also the total dollar cost. And I think that kind of weather pattern is going to continue to increase in Vermont. More severe rain, more severe wind, hail, and that kind of weather as our climate gets warmer here in northern New England. So I think it's something that can be measured and something we're excited about working on if it passes the legislature. I was waving to Senator Clarkson as well.
I apologize. I thought this started at 7. God, Esme is so on time. It turns out it started a whole hour ago. I am so embarrassed.
It's all good.
Anyway, it's good to see you all. Hi. But Becca has a question.
Yes, so I had a question because to Jesse's point, and we need to have Jesse come into Senate Natural Resources, so we don't leave at the end of this. But we are considering how do we create utilities so that you can have bondability, for example, for some of these large infrastructure projects. Could you describe a little bit about how the Treasurer's Office works with municipalities now for the bonding process, and how you could see potentially those two things coming together?
Yeah.
I've been out of the select board game for a bit.
So the question was, how does the Treasurer's Office of the state of Vermont work with municipal bonding, And most municipalities in Vermont will do their bonding through the Vermont Bond Bank, maybe with the exception of some of our larger communities like Burlington, where they would actually have their own credit rating and be able to independently go out and issue bonds. So when you work through the bond bank, they generally pool together, multiple projects across multiple municipalities. So maybe, you have 7 or 8 or 9 different projects that total $100 million, and the bond bank goes out for the $100 million with all of those projects as part of it. The treasurer sits on the bond bank board, so we have insight into the bond bank and work with them closely. But those bonds are not part of the state's sort of bonding obligation. The state's not on the hook for those. Those are the sole sort of universe of the municipalities and of the bond bank. We do our own separate bonding as a state, and that is done sort of independent, like the city of Burlington. We go out and issue our own bonds through, through our own financial professionals. And those are the responsibility, right, of the Vermont, not just the moral obligation, but the actual, balance sheet of our state. And then other entities too, well, like the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, or the state colleges potentially, VITA potentially, they may go out as instrumentalities of the state and do bonding also.
With housing.
Yeah, like with housing. And then we might have a moral obligation to back those up, but it's not a guaranteed, obligation to back them up. So there are other organizations that are now, the organizations that are sort of at the earliest moments of starting to think about accessing the capital markets in that way are actually the CUDs for broadband and internet connectivity. So there's one in this area. Yeah.
AC Fiber was hoping to go out to bond in 2011 or something.
Yeah, and they were able to get a credit rating and go out and do that, which is great. I mean, it's a big progress. But to your point, Senator Clarkson, it takes a long time to get ready for market, and you have to be able to show where your revenues are going to come from. Like, why are people going to invest in your bonds? And for a lot of the CUDs, they're so new, it's a little bit of a challenge. You're going to have to wait a while. And I think you might potentially have the same challenge if you created some other utilities. It comes down to where your revenue's coming from that can support the bond payments. And are the revenues consistent? Are they new revenues, or do they have a long track record? So if they have a long track record of being consistent, then that looks pretty good for somebody in the bond market.
But do you do anything with like the small utility companies? Like, do you ever get are there any programs specifically for like the Green Mountain Powers or Washington Electrics of the world? So you could have a thermal network that bonds through the municipal bond bank or through another entity?
Yeah, so they would. I think there could be a scenario where you had a utility that was municipally owned,
Yes,
and I think
yes.
they could then access potentially the bond bank for capital markets. If they're privately owned, they would have to go through the private markets for any kind of long-term debt.
Owner would be a municipal corporation.
Yeah. Okay. So then then that could be a possibility.
That's kind of interesting.
And it would take a few years to build up a bond rating.
Yes. That's what that Senator Clarkson with, the desire for EC Fiber to go out in 2011, and they only got their bond rating this year or last year. Yeah.
Yeah, but, they went out early, recession hit, they
Right,
had a bunch
yeah.
of early challenges.
So, but unlike the what was that?
CUD.
Five, yeah.
All right, so unlike CUD, if we had like a thermal energy network or utility, we would basically be able to forecast out rates and ratepayer compensation similar to Green Mountain Power and electricity rates. So hypothetically, a municipal corporation should be able to accelerate that timeline
Yeah.
with a very detailed analysis of.
Those are new revenues, Jesse? Those are, right? Am I understanding that right?
It would be new. Well, this is all contingent on what's the House bill, Senate bill.
Yeah.
We just got a new, there are two, they're both sides, but we have a new name for our geothermal bill, and I don't remember what number it got assigned yet.
It's like 251 on the Senate side.
Yeah.
But we should have you in as well.
Yeah.
Or someone from
Yeah.
bonds, because we're trying to debate.
Well, it's gonna, jump ahead of the bond.
We should have.
Yeah, for sure.
This is helpful.
But you'd want, so even if even if like even in that scenario, I think the market would want to see a history of revenue before it was comfortable relying on the projection of there being future revenue. So that's sort of
If we were to somehow, similar to like renewable energy finance, but it's a power purchase agreement long-term, if we were able to demonstrate that long-term revenue, we could get creative with that. I'm imagining that would solve that issue as well.
yeah, if there's a sort of a contract in place for people, people that are guaranteeing payment, into the as ratepayers for long term, then that could be something that helps manage that and navigate that. I mean, that locks in the revenue for some future period.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah.
I've got a little question and a big question.
Yeah. Nice.
The little question is, with the housing being purchased by a lot of out-of-state entities, what percentage of that is corporations that are buying housing, and how do you see that changing?
Yeah. So, There's sort of two ways that is impactful in Vermont right now. One is sort of a technical tax way, which is Vermont has two types of property taxes, residential, and non-residential. And non-residential could be a second home, it could be commercial, it could be something else. But individuals are putting their homes into LLCs, and then those LLCs all of a sudden are getting the non-residential tax rate, if that's beneficial to them, depending on where they live. So that's a way that, something that's happening in Vermont relative to property taxes to be mindful of and thoughtful of. The other is that it's generally big funds like pension funds or other kinds of institutional funds, maybe insurance companies, that have more and more been interested in buying homes as an investment, as a long-term investment. And I would assume that we have a similar proportion as what's happening around the rest of the country. Maybe we have a less amount because we're not as populated and our economy and growth rate isn't as dynamic as maybe parts of Arizona or California or San Francisco. But it is a problem, nationally in terms of, big corporations, big funds, big pension funds, big insurance companies buying up real estate as part of their long-term investment portfolio. So that puts more pressure on individuals that want to buy their home. There's not as many homes to buy anymore because those are turned into rentals. And that, I think, is for a lot of communities a challenge.
I think it also has a big effect on rental rates because the corporations jack up the rates.
Yeah, particularly depending on the community. Like all throughout Vermont, we have such a low vacancy rate that the median rental prices are already getting pushed up. And I'm sure that on top of that, they could artificially support even higher rents in Vermont just because that vacancy rate's so low.
My big question is that it's generally thought of as a truism that our economy needs to grow.
Yeah.
What is your brief synopsis of why that is?
Yeah.
And what the implications of it are?
Well, have you heard of donut economics? Is that a familiar term?
Yeah.
You have?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
I'm not a clear sense.
Well, I think the broad concept of donut economics is, there are only so many resources in the world to use and to consume, until they start having a negative impact, not just on your economy, but on broader society, on the broader world. So the biggest example here would be the impact that our economy has on fossil fuel and climate change and all of the various ways that impacts us across the globe. So, it's true that the economy always needs to be growing in the sense that people need to be productive in their own personal lives. They need to, most people are striving to, increase their income, increase their assets, build toward retirement. Population is growing as well, even in places where it's not growing very fast, it's still growing, which requires more resources for those individuals. And those individuals and their growth rate is partly what sort of, pushes on the economy, as well as more productive members enter the workforce. So I think we need to balance the impact that our economy has on our daily lives and our environment with that need to be able to have personal opportunity and growth in terms of achieving more income and in terms of achieving more assets, getting yourself in a secure financial position. But I think it's also going to get upended over the next 10 to 20 years, and maybe this is why the question around guaranteed income came in, because so many jobs in the economy are going away because they're being automated out of existence. The things that people used to do now, can be done by AI or by machine or by, automation. And what does that mean for our economy in the future when we don't have people at the center of our economy producing things and growing it, but there's actually not, people are not at the center of our economy, and what does that mean for what does that mean for our economy to grow into the future, and for whom does that benefit? So I think there are a lot of profound questions on the horizon that we're going to have to address relative to economic growth in our country. Yeah, interesting question. Yeah, Esme.
What that sparked immediately in me too is I really appreciate you bringing up donut economics because it speaks to how we need to learn to live within our ecological boundaries and take that deeply into consideration, whereas in other times in history we've just said go up. And I think people are becoming more cognizant of the fact that that's not the way to live.
Yeah.
But also we can talk about growth all day and we can keep growing and turns out we're the wealthiest country in the world. But what does that mean? I think really the importance is how that wealth is distributed and who has access to that wealth. And hopefully that's where democracy can come into play. And I think that's partly why I was so excited to bring Mike here is because, you know, he, through a policy and administrative lens, has championed these ideas that are, you know, trying to be smart and efficient and not wasteful of the wealth that we do have that already exists. You know, gratefully, none of these programs that he's referenced have a tax implication, like,
Yeah,
which
true.
is kind of a rare find, and it's pretty special. But rather than, you know, growth, I think we should reframe in terms of access to our means and what's already available. But
And
That's a great
just to
point.
tack on to Esme's, Allison Clarkson, just to tag on to Esme's fine point, we should also be reading limits to growth, and we should also be looking and supporting some of the Senate's work on extended producer responsibility.
oh yeah,
Yeah, so that when a manufacturer is producing something, and its useful vehicle to our lives is over, it needs to then be returned to the manufacturer to be recycled, renewed, reincorporated into new products. So I think to operate within our donut, we also have to begin to, just like with our LED, our bulbs, our paint, many of the things that we have extended producer responsibility now, you will see more and more of that kind of legislation coming forward. We were hoping to have that with the bottle bill. It looks like sadly the bottle bill is not probably going to pass because the Senate's not able to override the governor's veto. Unfortunately, profoundly disappointing to your two senators here. But we live to fight another day.
I'm not accepting it till the vote.
Yeah, which is tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And so that donut, we need to figure out creative ways to return, recycle, reuse what we're growing with and how we grow by renewing what we already have created.
Yeah. And maybe Esme's point, you know, made me think of yeah, I mean, that equity, or, you know, at the center of our economy, like growth for whose benefit. And maybe that's to your question. Like if our economy is growing and it's only going to a certain population and it's having environmental impacts, then that's not really the economy that we want, right? I would think, so when I think of it, the Vermont economy, like what would I want to see the Vermont economy doing? I'd want to see our GDP growing. I'd want to see our median income growing, and I'd want to see our wealth disparity shrinking, right? That, to me, would be the sign of a healthy Vermont economy to achieve those three things.
Here, here.
Oh, well.
Yeah, Kim.
Accommodating climate migrants, I mean, there's going to certainly be, you know, we have, Vermont's one of those green zones and all the stuff.
Yes.
Well, actually, you know, we've been hearing from the disaster atlas, we're not such a safe place. We're like seventh top emergency declarations in the country. I mean, we have natural disasters that are really challenging, and we're, you know, everybody should take a peek at NYU's disaster atlas to, you know, if I was a climate refugee, I'm not actually sure I'd actually want to come here. I mean, we have a couple of them, as we all know, but looking at the statistics, Vermont does not
Yeah.
look
I think on that point, Sen,
climate place.
On that point, Senator Clarkson, I think it's helpful to think about like what is happening elsewhere relative to the climate, right, in the country. Like and then what's going to happen in the future. Like there are places that will run out of water, right? I mean, so like that is a dire situation. There are places that are going to be so hot it's going to be hard to live, or places that have constant threat of wildfire or smoke. And we unfortunately saw some of that last summer too in terms of smoke. But I think a lot of the challenges we face in Vermont, we can build a more resilient Vermont for those challenges. I think a lot of other places are going to struggle to build a more resilient community for themselves.
Agreed.
Yeah.
But it will take us billions and billions of
Yeah.
dollars to do so, and it will take 20 to 30 years.
It's another long-term issue.
Mitigation is
Yeah.
gonna be expensive, and it's gonna take us a lot of
Long-term.
time. And we're we've started, but, everyone wants a quick fix for some of this.
Yeah.
And it will take a long time for us to figure out how to take our community centers, many of whom are right along our most challenging rivers, and figure out how we move. No one wants to move. How do we move people up? How do we create land banks in
Yeah.
communities so that we can move people thoughtfully and keep them in their community?
And in Vermont, it's kind of exacerbating a situation that already existed in the sense of when I am in Chittenden County during the July flooding, the Winooski River is raging and people go to watch it as a spectacle almost, right? But the storms that have had almost no impact on Chittenden County or our economy, which was already in many ways ahead of much of the rest of the Vermont economy. So then Montpelier, Barrie, Londonderry, Johnson, Hardwick,
Boston,
yeah,
Ludlow.
these places that are struggling get walloped and they fall further behind. So even in Vermont, we have to, climate change is going to exacerbate is a better word, those regional economic discrepancies, which is another reason we have to focus on it. Yeah.
Can Treasury see other ways to prevent carbon dioxide generation in Vermont? I know the transportation sector is our worst problem. Do you have any future ideas about how to use economic pressures to abate carbon dioxide generation?
Yeah. Well, I think, we mentioned, transportation certainly a key, but I think just our housing stock, being able to weatherize it so that we use less of it is also key. And so I think that, but, honestly, one of the challenges that comes with weatherization comes back to workforce and finding enough people to be able to do the work. And it's the same kind of issue with housing. To build the housing, we need more people to build the housing. So it's good. We have a lot of limitations as it relates to weatherization, but I think that's going to have to be one of our keys. I think we also need to think about other industries that are not leaving a big environmental footprint. One of the industries where Vermont is the national and international leader is captive insurance. We are number one in the world for all measurements on captive insurance, and it's a clean industry that supports hundreds of jobs in Vermont, brings tens of millions of dollars to our state in direct and indirect ways. So that's a great example, and I think there are ways we can build on that. So it's really just being, I think, mindful of what kind of economy we build for the future in our state. Yeah.
Going back to the subject of climate mitigation and adaptation for that, has there been any talks about ways to make communities in Vermont, and also just Vermont in general, a more walkable state?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's key, right? When we talk about downtown density and wanting people to be downtown, like it's for the purpose of not needing a car as much. But, you also have to make sure that you've built the infrastructure that makes it safe for people to be able to be out walking. There's statistics that show the number of individual pedestrians hit by cars has gone up considerably over the last few years. And I believe most of those have happened in the evening. That's where the growth has happened the most. So there are a lot of factors for that, including smartphones and other issues. So I think building in safe and also just making sure cities are walkable, but also building it in so that they're safe is important too.
Because there are places around here that take 4 minutes to get to by car versus half an hour. So
By walking.
Yeah.
And you're saying that's because there's not like good sidewalks, or just in terms of just how long it takes to walk generally?
Just we need a denser
So those,
setting.
yeah, so like the grocery store needs to be closer to the downtown, or whatever the example might
Yeah,
be.
more stores downtown, and also to go with that, more apartments or houses, whatever works best.
Yeah, right. No, I totally agree. I mean, that's the reason. I mean, I live in Winooski, which is like the most densely populated city in Vermont, or town in Vermont. And, oftentimes when I'm home from Montpelier, I don't use my car again until I need to leave for Montpelier again. And that's nice.
No, we're working on it. Reducing barriers to that density in downtowns and village centers. More to follow.
Excellent.
Folks, given that it is a school night.
Oh, yeah.
And Mike has driven a ways to be with us tonight. Maybe we can have like one last question. And then we'll just wrap it up.
Peggy almost got gone.
That's like
I
the,
can ask.
that's like the auction. That's like the auction, Peggy.
Oh, you go ahead.
I had more than my share, but I'd read somewhere in the Times or a Vermont paper that there had been an ebb of all the incoming migrants. They've all moved, or some of them have moved back to Brooklyn.
Oh, right. I saw that in the New York Post. I saw a story about that for sure.
New York Post.
Yeah.
Oh, they're always trustworthy.
He reads everything.
So
New York Post has the best headlines.
your rosy data is
Yeah.
that up until
It's as much as it's as recently available. So the IRS data was 2020 and 2021, so they're a little delayed. The 2022 data will come out this April, so we're really waiting for that. The census data, which also showed that it corresponded with the IRS data. It was different in terms of the total number, but the census data showed 17,500 people had moved to Vermont in the last 2 years, which was more than the last 10 years combined. And a recent update to the census data from December showed that we had, the growth rate was small, but that we continued to grow.
And Windsor County is at the top.
Oh, nice. So one of the just broadly from our one of the other underlying issues that demographically that we have to confront, and why I think inbound migration is so important, is because if you look at our birth rates and death rates over the last 10 years, we used to have a gap for the benefit, meaning we had more babies born in Vermont in a given year than people who had died. And that gap was getting narrower and narrower, and now it's crossed. So now we have more people dying every year than babies born. So if we don't have more babies being born, if those trends continue, then if we're going to solve our workforce challenges and have a population that is reasonably growing, then inbound migration is going to be the key to that. So that's why we're keeping such a close eye on that. But we also have to think about ways we can support young families as well, which the legislature is keenly aware of and focused on. Yeah. Thanks, Joe.
I think this was helpful. I want to thank the treasurer for coming and dropping some knowledge on it. I also want to thank the representative and both of our senators. I think this is important because sometimes there is a disconnect between Montpelier and the rest of the state. And I think it's important that information is getting to our constituents. So thank you so very much for that. And we're going to try to do this again with other representatives as well as our senators more and more. So thank you, Jam, and thank you, Treasurer, and have a good evening.
I have like 3 people in here.
Yay! Good job. That was awesome.
Yeah.
We almost.